My name is Henry, and if you grew up in my family, you'd quickly learn that dinners weren't about eating together or bonding. They were about who could humiliate who the most. My relatives treated gatherings like battlegrounds where the only weapons were mockery, comparisons, and smug little remarks disguised as jokes. I'm 28 now, but I still remember being a kid at those Sunday dinners, sitting at the long oak table in my grandparents' house, listening to my Uncle Gerard hold court. He was my dad's older brother, a man who wore tailored suits even to a family barbecue and spoke to everyone like they worked for him. Gerard owned a mid-sized company back then, some sort of regional supplier business. To the rest of the family, he was the shining star, the self-made man, the one everyone held up as the standard. To me, he was the guy who looked me in the eye when I was 13 and said, "Henry, you're just not cut out for success. Stick to something simple." At the time, I was too young to understand how cruel that was. But it stuck. Every time I saw him, he'd find a way to slip in a jab about how I wasn't like my cousins. His son Mark, for instance, who was supposedly destined to inherit the business and carry the family name with pride. The funny part? I was never the kid who caused trouble. I wasn't loud. I wasn't disrespectful. I just liked keeping to myself, working on small projects, tinkering with ideas, reading things nobody else in the family cared about. But to Gerard, that was proof I was lazy or weak. The rest of the family didn't help much. My Aunt Muriel, Gerard's sister, was no better. She loved putting on this sweet tone when she spoke to me, but it always carried an edge. "Oh, Henry, still trying those little business experiments? Isn't it better to just get a real job? Security matters, dear." She'd smile as if she were worried about me, but everyone at the table knew she was twisting the knife. My parents? They never defended me. If anything, they'd nod along to Gerard's speeches, probably because they didn't want to be on the receiving end of his ridicule either. I learned to sit quietly, eat quickly, and leave as soon as possible. But over the years, the bitterness grew. I started building something on my own, quietly, in the background. A small business that at first looked like nothing. My family dismissed it entirely. When I mentioned it once, Gerard chuckled and said, "That sounds like a hobby, not a career." Muriel added, "Oh, Henry, you're so creative, but creativity doesn't pay the bills." Even my cousin Mark smirked, whispering loud enough for me to hear, "At least I'll never have to beg for a job." I stopped bringing it up after that. No point in giving them more ammunition. Years passed. My little hobby grew legs. While my relatives thought I was wasting time, I was working 14-hour days, reinvesting everything I earned, building connections with people who actually believed in innovation. I didn't make big announcements. I didn't brag. I just worked. Fast forward to a few weeks ago. My grandmother insisted on hosting another family dinner, and as much as I wanted to skip it, she's the only one in that house who ever treated me with real kindness. So I went. The second I walked in, I could tell nothing had changed. Gerard was already laughing at one of his own jokes. Muriel was seated with her nose in the air, and Mark greeted me with a limp handshake that dripped with superiority. I took a seat near the end of the table, trying to focus on the food and not the conversation. But of course, Gerard had to notice me. "Well, if it isn't Henry," he said, his voice booming across the table. "Tell us, what have you been doing with yourself these days? Still dabbling in those little side projects?" His words were coated in fake curiosity, but his grin made it clear what he really meant. I took a slow sip of water, trying not to rise to the bait. "I've been keeping busy," I said simply. "Busy?" Muriel repeated with a laugh, shaking her head. "That's such a vague answer. You must not have much to show if you can't be specific." Mark chimed in. "Probably still in that tiny apartment, right? Working on his hustles." He made air quotes, and everyone except my grandmother chuckled. I set my fork down, staring at my plate. For a moment, I thought about letting it go. It was easier, after all. Let them think what they wanted. But something in me snapped that night. Because the truth was, things had changed. A lot. I had quietly made moves none of them had any idea about. And sitting there, listening to Gerard hold court like he always did, I realized I didn't have to take it anymore. He leaned back in his chair, smirking at me. "Henry, let me give you some advice. Some men are meant to build, others are meant to follow. You're a follower. And there's no shame in that, unless you start pretending otherwise." The table erupted in laughter. I didn't laugh. I folded my napkin slowly, placed it beside my plate, and looked Gerard straight in the eye. And that's when I said it. Interesting, uncle. Considering I just bought your company. The laughter died instantly. Gerard's smirk vanished, replaced by a frown. Bought what company? The table went silent. Muriel's fork hovered in midair. Mark's mouth dropped open. My parents stared at me as if I'd just spoken another language. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. For once, my Uncle Gerard didn't have the last word. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like he couldn't quite form a sentence. Bought what company? He repeated, slower this time. His voice had lost its usual booming confidence. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking under the weight of their judgment. I was calm, steady, watching the cracks form in their carefully constructed superiority. My Aunt Muriel was the first to recover. She set her fork down with a sharp clink and leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Henry, are you joking? Please tell me you're not trying to embarrass yourself with some fantasy in front of everyone. I gave a small shrug. No joke. My cousin Mark snorted, though there was an edge of uncertainty in it. That's impossible. Dad's company isn't something you can just buy. You wouldn't even know where to start. I finally turned my gaze toward him. Funny you should say that. Turns out I knew exactly where to start. The tension at the table was growing heavier by the second. My parents sat frozen, my mother's hand hovering over her glass of water, my father avoiding my eyes altogether. They looked as though they'd been caught in the middle of a storm they never prepared for. Gerard leaned forward, his face turning red. You expect me to believe that you, of all people, managed to pull off something like this? No, you're bluffing. Why would I bluff? I asked evenly. It's already done. My grandmother, bless her, was the only one who didn't look horrified. Instead, she folded her hands gently in her lap and gave me the smallest nod of encouragement, as if she'd known all along I had more in me than the rest of them believed. But the others? They were spiraling. Henry, Muriel said sharply, her tone dripping with disdain. If this is some cruel attempt at humiliating your uncle, you should stop now before you make yourself look ridiculous. He has built something far beyond your reach. You wouldn't even understand the first step of a deal like that. Her words stung, but not in the way they once would have. They didn't make me feel small anymore. They just revealed how little she understood the world outside her own narrow circle. I set my elbows on the table, leaning slightly forward. That's where you're wrong, Aunt. I understood every step. I've been studying Gerard's company for years, its strengths, weaknesses, who his competitors were, and which contracts he was struggling to keep up with. I knew exactly when to move. And I moved. The look on Gerard's face was something I'll never forget. The man who once spoke to me like I was beneath him now sat staring as if he didn't recognize me at all. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the tablecloth. Mark tried again, but this time his voice cracked slightly. Even if you tried something, you wouldn't have the money. You're not. He stopped himself, swallowing hard. You're not in that league. Maybe you never paid attention to what I was doing, I said, my tone still measured. But that doesn't mean I wasn't building something real. While you were mocking me, I was working. I didn't need to be in your league, Mark. I created my own. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Henry, is this true? I turned to him. Yes, every word. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. He looked more tired than surprised, as though he was realizing how badly he'd underestimated me all these years. My mother just sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting between me and Gerard. The air grew heavier by the second. No one reached for their food. No one dared move. Gerard slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can just swoop in and undo everything I've built? You have no idea what you're dealing with. I didn't flinch. On the contrary, Uncle, I know exactly what I'm dealing with. And I made sure every step I took was legal, airtight, and irreversible. Muriel's face twisted with anger. This is disgraceful. To come here, to sit at this table, and to throw something like that in our faces, it's vile, Henry. Absolutely vile. I tilted my head. Vile? Or inconvenient? The silence that followed was deafening. My grandmother gently set her fork down, but her expression was almost serene, as if she'd been waiting years for this shift in the family dynamic. Mark muttered under his breath, "This can't be happening." But it was. I leaned back, folding my hands together calmly. You've all spent years laughing at me, dismissing me, treating me as though I was less than. Tonight, the only thing I did was tell you the truth. If you can't handle it, that's not my problem. Gerard's eyes narrowed into slits, his face a deep shade of red. If what you say is true, then you've made yourself an enemy you'll regret having. Gerard slammed his fists on the table again, not loud enough to startle my grandmother, but loud enough that everyone flinched. He looked like a man who'd just found out the ground he'd been standing on had been quietly removed. I felt a calm heat inside me, the kind that comes from months of planning finally meeting the moment it was meant for. Regret, I echoed. Uncle, I don't want you to regret me personally. I want you to regret the choices you made that put you in a position where someone like me could step in and clean up the mess. The table erupted into shocked murmurs. Muriel's lips thinned until they were almost invisible. Mark's face had drained of color. My parents' expressions were complicated: shame, bewilderment, a trace of pride that made me feel guilty for a second, then vanish when I remembered the years of belittling. Clean up the mess? Gerard spat the words as if they were poison. This is my company. I built it from the ground up. I'm the reason any of you had opportunities. You built an empire on short-term wins and cutting corners, I said softly. On safe contracts that kept clients comfortable, but you let long-term deals rot. You bought flashy machinery instead of maintaining relationships. You rewarded loyalty with lectures and punished dissent with silence. That's not a foundation, it's a house of cards. And it's the sort of thing my partners and I look for. Not because we want to destroy, but because we know how to fix. Silence took the room again. Granny reached for my hand under the table and squeezed. Her knuckles were warm and trembling, like she was holding on to something she'd been afraid to say out loud for years. How did you even? Mark started, then stopped. He had no script for this. I let them stew a moment longer. Then I outlined, in plain terms, everything they already suspected and refused to admit. The company had been underperforming for 3 years. Wages had been stretched thin to hide shortfalls. A few key contracts were up for renewal, and the other side had been quietly courting competitors. I described the meeting I'd had with 2 of Gerard's longtime clients, how I'd listened to them talk about broken promises and missed deliveries, and how I'd offered them a clean slate under a new ownership structure. I mentioned the small group of investors who believed in my approach, people who saw value where Gerard saw vanity. I told them, without flourish, that we'd bought enough shares quietly over the last 12 months to present a legitimate offer, and when board oversight failed to act, shareholders accepted. Every sentence seemed to puncture a part of Gerard's armor. He hunched forward, his tie limp, the confident posture gone. For the first time I saw someone who'd been immune to consequences actually confronted by them. It was not a beautiful sight. It was, however, necessary. You lied to us, Muriel accused. You sat at this table and pretended to be one of us while you were plotting to steal from family. It wasn't theft, I said. It was a legal acquisition. There's a difference between stealing and recognizing value that the original owner no longer appreciates. I didn't take anything that wasn't available for purchase. You all had every opportunity to save the company or support it. Instead, you mocked it and me. My father cleared his throat. Was there any foul play? Any backdoor deals with creditors? Have you looked into the loans? He sounded like a man trying to hold 2 truths at once. The family myth that Gerard could do no wrong, and the dawning realization that maybe he had. I did my due diligence, I said. My team and I brought in accountants and lawyers. We didn't act on rumors. We acted on numbers and contracts. We reached out to employees individually, not to poach, but to promise stability. When the board ignored a request to address liquidity issues, shareholders responded. That last part was the hinge. Gerard's nostrils flared. You went behind my back to the shareholders? You connived with outsiders to take what You let things go for years, I interrupted. You refused to replace a failing COO because he was a friend. You laughed off maintenance requests because the quarterly reports looked good. You prioritized ego over survival. I didn't take your company. You abandoned it. In the sudden hush, Mark looked at his father as if expecting him to retort with the usual abrasion, the comeback that would belittle and dismiss. When it didn't come, Mark's face folded into something like dread. The conversation ended abruptly when my uncle pushed back from the table so hard his chair skidded. He stood with all the theatrical indignation he'd rehearsed 100 times but never actually had to play. You think you can just walk into my life and rearrange everything? I'll have lawyers. I'll call everyone. You'll see. This will be overturned. Call lawyers, I said, and my voice was ice simple. You are welcome to try. We have paperwork. We have shareholders' approvals. We have binding contracts. Legal challenges are expected. That's why the acquisition was structured to withstand them. He left before dessert. Not a slow exit to collect himself. An eye-level, slammed door, fist on the car hood, kind of departure that left the house breathing heavily. The family followed him like an afterthought, the kind of loyalty born of proximity rather than affection. Only Granny stayed, and she nodded at me, the small motion of a woman who'd witnessed seasons change and knew which ones would be bitter and which would be bearable. After he was gone, the rest of the night unfolded like a play where everyone tried to act normal. Conversations resumed on safe topics. The weather, a new neighbor, but every sentence was edged with the knowledge that nothing had stayed the same. I sat and listened to the polite cruelty and the disguised concern, and a small part of me mourned the years lost. But a larger part of me felt vindicated. Validation is not the same as revenge, but it clears the path to it. Revenge, to me, was never about spectacle. I didn't want to humiliate Gerard with a viral video or a dramatic monologue on the front steps of the company. I wanted to dismantle the structures that allowed him to mistreat people while keeping the appearance of competence. I wanted accountability. And in that, I had a plan that would be slow, surgical, and utterly public in its finality. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the dossier I'd kept in a locked drawer for months. It was thick with copies of emails, vendor notices, delayed maintenance work orders, HR complaints that had been ignored, and financial statements that, when read in sequence, told a very different story than the one at family dinners. I had names of managers who'd been sidelined for speaking up and testimonies from clients who'd been ghosted. I had contracts showing penalties Gerard had somehow overlooked, and those penalties added up. I didn't send everything at once. That would be satisfyingly cruel but counterproductive. Instead, I began with small moves designed to probe and to pressure. The first was internal, a quiet conversation with the HR director, Maria, a woman who'd been overlooked for a promotion for years because she'd dared to suggest reforms. She met me for coffee a week after the acquisition closed, her hands wrapped around a mug like an anchor. "You're not here to run me out, are you?" she asked, suspicion braided with exhaustion. "I'm here to give you a seat at the table," I told her. "I want to know what's been happening, what people are afraid to say, and who needs protection. I want the truth, even if it hurts." Maria's eyes softened. She told me about teams who worked double shifts without overtime, about a supplier that had been paid late so Gerard could buy a new executive car, about a safety inspection that had been delayed because spending on repairs was frowned upon. She gave me documents and names, and, most importantly, a list of people who would testify if asked. Next came the clients. I didn't threaten them. I apologized. I offered solutions. I promised a different leadership and then followed through with immediate action, reinstating missed deliveries, waiving fees where Gerard's mismanagement had cost them money, assigning senior personnel to manage key contracts. Within weeks, one disgruntled former client became an advocate. Another scheduled a meeting to renegotiate terms, this time with my team in the room. Meanwhile, public perception mattered. I carefully crafted a message for employees and stakeholders: stability, transparency, and a commitment to fixing problems that had been ignored. I made sure the message wasn't aggressive. It was competent. It was precise. That competence, more than anything, began to erode Gerard's legend among the company's clients and partners. People noticed a difference in months, not years, and they liked what they saw. Back at home, though, the family's reaction evolved into something different and more corrosive than I expected. There were whispered conversations when I arrived at another gathering. Invitations became tentative. Muriel tried to buy allies with passive-aggressive civility. Mark retreated into resentment and blunt questions. Gerard called once, a cold, clipped conversation where he warned me that I'd harvested a field I didn't understand. He threatened legal action and reputation damage. He sent emails to former colleagues with insinuations about my methods. I let his words bounce harmlessly off the armor of documents and legal counsel I'd assembled. That was when I escalated. Not with drama, with structure. I called a meeting with the executive team for the following Tuesday, and instead of storming in as the new owner, I sent a short, measured message. We needed to audit operations, prioritize employee safety, and begin immediate remediation on the most critical client contracts. I requested their cooperation and their honesty. The reply was mixed. Some were relieved, others fearful. On Monday evening, 2 days before the planned meeting, I received an anonymous package at my office. Inside was a folder of internal memos that corroborated much of what Maria had told me, including a note showing Gerard had been warned about a supplier issue that eventually cost the company a major contract. The sender had left a simple line: "We were ignored." It was a soft plea and a loud indictment at the same time. Whoever sent it wanted the company fixed, not the drama of a scandal. At the Tuesday meeting, I presented the audit plan and the remediation schedule. I didn't gloat. I didn't taunt. I was methodical, almost tedious with the details, because details win where theatrics falter. When I laid out the sequence that led to their biggest contract loss, a silence fell that was heavier than any family dinner. Heads nodded, pens scratched. A few executives who had been complicit in covering things up shifted uncomfortably. After the meeting, while people filed out, the COO, the friend Gerard had protected, pulled me aside. "You're making enemies," he said quietly, not an accusation but a fact. "I'm making accountability," I replied. He left without another word. Later that day, a letter arrived. Gerard had filed for an injunction claiming the acquisition had been procured by fraud. It was the move I expected and had planned for. Lawyers for both sides took their positions like chess pieces. Media murmurs began to stir. A regional business news column dug into the story, asking for comment. I provided measured, fact-based statements. The narrative began to tilt. Competence versus ego, stewardship versus neglect. At home, the family fracture widened. My parents were torn between loyalty to blood and the new, undeniable truth that perhaps they'd supported the wrong man. Muriel staged small confrontations, trying to accuse me of betrayal. Mark stopped speaking to me entirely. Our few interactions were thin and formal. Gerard alternated between public bluster and private pleadings through intermediaries. And then came the call that changed everything. Not a legal move, not a public statement, but a small, cruelly personal gambit that told me exactly how cornered Gerard felt. He'd sent an old family friend, someone who'd been like an uncle to me, to ask me to settle, to make amends so the family could be spared scandal. The friend's voice trembled as he described Gerard's desperation. He implied eldercare considerations, legacy, the way a man wants to be remembered. It was an attempt to weaponize sentiment. It almost worked, but I had already decided that this was not about vengeance for one humiliation at a dinner table. This was about protecting people who had been sidelined by Gerard's pride. The employees, the clients, the managers who had been dismissed for pointing out rot. I told the friend plainly that nostalgia did not absolve harm, and that if Gerard wanted to negotiate a dignified exit, the company would offer fair terms. Not silence, not adoration, just fair terms and an expectation of accountability. When I told my parents what I'd said, they recoiled. "You sound cruel," my mother whispered. "You're fighting a war with family." "I'm trying to save jobs," I answered. "I'm trying to fix something you all loved because you believed in the image more than the practice." The next morning, Gerard's lawyer called my counsel and demanded an emergency injunction to freeze the board's decisions until the court reviewed the acquisition paperwork. The language was precise, the tone all business. My legal team, confident and prepared, filed the appropriate counters. Lawyers began to tower over the story like gray clouds. The court date was set for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, whispers turned to headlines, and the company, once Gerard's fortress, became a place of cautious waiting. It was in that waiting room, while the legal gears began to grind, that I decided the next step. The injunction could slow us. It could create noise. It could, if handled correctly, highlight the very issues I wanted addressed. So I made a choice. I would not only defend the acquisition legally, but I would make the company's problems impossible to ignore. I slated a public briefing for investors and clients, not a PR stunt, but a transparent disclosure of the audit findings and the remediation plan. I invited the press. I invited long-ignored stakeholders. I invited anyone with a right to know. It was bold. It was risky. It was necessary. That evening, as I sat drafting the press release, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number at first, then a number I recognized, Gerard's cell. I didn't answer. He left a message instead, terse and raw. He wanted a private meeting that night. He said there were things I didn't understand about the company, about the board, about the obligations that couldn't be fixed by kids with money. He asked for mercy in one breath and threatened me in the next. I listened to the message twice and felt my pulse steady. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I called him back. We met 10 minutes later in the driveway outside my grandmother's house, the same place where he'd stormed out 2 nights before. His car idled with the engine off, like he'd deliberately killed it, so the conversation could not be overheard by anything but the night. He looked exhausted and smaller than the man who'd once dominated any room. "You don't have to make this personal," he started. "I already did," I said. "When you spoke of me as lesser for years, when you dismissed my work and my worth, you made it personal." "I didn't start this." "You did." He clenched his jaw. "If you go public with the audit, you'll destroy what little reputation we have left. People will lose confidence. Employees will leave. You'll be responsible for wrecking people's lives." "I'm responsible for fixing them," I replied. "And if people choose to leave because of how things were run, I would rather have a smaller, honest company than a larger, dishonest one." He stared at me for a long moment, something like pity crossing his features, then hardened. "You were always clever with numbers and words, Henry. But there are things you don't get about legacy. Legacy isn't about being adored," I said. "It's about being remembered as someone who didn't bankrupt others for his ego." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You and I will see whose legacy endures." He turned to his car, then paused. "One more thing," he said, in a voice that didn't belong to the man who'd left dinner in a storm. "If your paper trail is so airtight, how do you explain the loan guarantee I signed on behalf of the company 3 years ago? If creditors call that in, everyone, you included, could be in serious trouble." For the first time since I'd announced the purchase, I felt a genuine unease. It was a legal landmine I'd known about, but hoped would stay dormant. The guarantee was a complex instrument. If creditors had grounds to accelerate, it could cause immediate liquidity problems. I met his gaze. He looked like a man who'd just drawn a line in the sand and dared me to cross it. Behind him, the house lights glowed through the windows where family members slept unaware of the next chess move. "You think that will stop me?" I asked softly. "You think a threat like that will keep me from pressing forward?" He hesitated. For a sliver of a second, I saw the old man behind the bravado, tired, frightened, clinging to control. Then the mask returned. "You'll find out," he said. I could have answered. I could have promised restraint, or mercy, or legal counters. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind already mapping legal paths, contingency plans, and public strategies. The board needed to be informed, clients reassured, and the press prepared. The creditors, if they were roused, would be negotiated with or litigated. Every reaction had a counter, every threat a response. As I climbed the porch steps, my phone vibrated with a message from Maria. "There's something else. Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring your lawyer." I stopped mid-step. The night had just gotten sharper. The game had changed. Gerard had threatened a nuclear option, and someone on the inside had more to reveal. I read Maria's message again. The porch light flickered. The house behind me was quiet. Inside, arrangements for the legal fight were taking shape. Outside, the southern sky hinted at dawn. And I knew, with a clarity that felt like both relief and dread, that the next 48 hours would decide more than just a company's future. They would decide whether a family's myth could survive the truth, and whether the people who had been silenced would finally be heard. I put my key in the lock, paused, and didn't go inside. I sat on the steps and stared at the street, thinking about the long list of slights and the cold, slow work of undoing them. The sound of a car in the distance reminded me that nothing about this would be quiet for long. 2 words popped into my head: exposure and repair. One would burn, the other would build. I had to choose how quickly to burn and how deeply to build. Before I could make that call, my phone buzzed again, this time with a forwarded email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Confidential, board minutes, and loan guarantee details attached." I froze. My stomach became a small, tight knot. The document preview showed a scanned page with signatures I recognized. My thumb hovered over the file. I stared at the scanned page until the words blurred. Gerard's signature, the company seal, and a clause that read like an admission. I won't pretend it wasn't a punch to the gut. 3 years earlier, in a cash flow pinch, Gerard had personally guaranteed a line of credit to keep an important supplier afloat. The board minutes next to it didn't read like a defense. They read like willful omission. The minutes showed the board had been warned that liquidity was precarious, that certain contracts were at risk unless management repaired relationships and adjusted payment schedules. The minutes also showed the board, Gerard included, voted to defer serious fixes for another quarter. That clause changed everything. If creditors tried to accelerate the debt and called in the guarantee, it wouldn't just put the company at risk. It could put Gerard personally on the hook. The nuclear option he'd threatened with an offhand comment at the driveway suddenly had a face. I called my lawyer at midnight and forwarded the file. I called Maria and told her to be ready at 8 with everything else she had. I slept the way you do when your brain keeps busy, in fits, with tabs of contingencies open in the back of my mind. The next morning, the first thing I did was tell myself to slow down. The cagey moves, the traps, they all hinged on timing and clarity, not vengeful theatrics. My legal team put together a response to Gerard's injunction that was meticulous, unflashy, and damning in the way only cold documents can be. We attached the board minutes, supplier notices, emails where Gerard dismissed warnings as temporary blips, and the bank's loan agreement with Gerard's guarantee highlighted. We filed an emergency motion asking the court not to freeze board actions, and we asked the judge to consider whether Gerard's own management decisions had created the instability he now claimed had been engineered by me. At the same time, I set another axis of pressure into motion: transparency. 2 days before the hearing, I sent a carefully worded memo to employees, clients, and a short list of stakeholders, including major creditors. No accusations, no gloating, just the facts, the audit findings, the remediation plan, and an offer to meet with anyone who needed reassurances. I included an invitation to a public briefing after the court hearing, promising nothing theatrical, only evidence of a path forward. There are 2 things I learned quickly. 1, people respect competence more than rhetoric. 2, nobody likes being left in the dark. Once the clients saw a concrete plan, who would manage their accounts, timelines for recovered deliveries, and offer to waive past penalties where we'd failed them, they started answering my messages with sentences I'd never heard from the same people when Gerard ran the show. Thank you for reaching out. This looks promising. We'll give you a chance to prove it. It didn't erase the losses, but it bought breathing room. The court date felt like a weather front. Gerard's lawyers argued loudly that the acquisition was a hostile takeover built on deception. They painted me as the boogeyman who preyed on a family business. My lawyers responded with documents and depositions, emails showing the board's failure to act, testimony from long-term employees about ignored warnings, and the shareholders' vote records. We were asking the judge to see the acquisition not as theft, but as a remedy for governance failure. We also put the loan guarantee on the table with an argument that if Gerard wanted to call in the lenders, they should be the ones to weigh the consequences of subjecting the company to forced liquidation, something creditors rarely wanted. The hearing lasted a morning. It was tense and procedural and utterly bureaucratic, exactly the kind of thing that favored the party with better organization and integrity. Ultimately, the judge denied Gerard's emergency injunction. He was not exonerated. The court made clear that the merits would be decided later. But for the immediate term, the company remained under the new board's authority. That was the hinge I'd built my plan on. Within 24 hours of the ruling, the press that had sniffed around began to write in a tone that didn't always favor my uncle. The narrative shifted from family feud to management failure and rescue. Headlines don't fix factories or outstanding invoices, but they do move people. Creditors, who had been receiving Gerard's agitation, suddenly wanted to talk to me. We arranged a meeting with the primary lender. Sitting across from a senior banking officer in a glass conference room, I laid out the remediation plan: restructure the problematic supplier contracts, reassign several managers who'd been protecting the status quo, institute a temporary cash sweep to guarantee core deliveries, and deploy a small bridge loan from our investors to handle short-term liquidity. I didn't plead. I didn't promise miracles. I showed projections and named the team who would deliver. The bank's rep was a pragmatic person. "We don't want to take it over," she said. "If you can show us wins in 60 days, we'll be much more inclined to support a restructuring rather than accelerate." Her voice was not merciful, it was transactional. That was all we needed. We gave her the timelines, the payment waterfalls, the names of the senior managers now accountable, and the bank agreed to a covenant amendment that kept the guarantee in effect but prevented an immediate acceleration unless clear thresholds were missed. It wasn't a total victory. Guarantees are dangerous in the wrong hands. But the lenders preferred value over drama, and that preference was enough for them to step back from a nuclear move. I bought time, exactly what we needed to deliver wins. Back home, the family's reaction became readable like a worn map, patterns repeated with slight variation. Muriel called to demand explanations. She accused me, again, of betrayal. She used phrases like legacy, shame, and family reputation, as if those things were currency that could override harm. Mark sent curt messages through his mother that stopped at insults that were more sorrowful for their limpness than for any real bite. Gerard, now more volatile, alternated between blistering emails and imploring intermediaries to settle this before it destroys the family name. He tried one last attempt to weaponize mutual acquaintances, to get board members to join him. The people who'd once bowed to his charm were now reading documents and making calculations. I didn't take pleasure in the slow unraveling of his narrative. Vindication felt too small a word. The rest of the company's board, some members who'd been complicit, some who'd been passive, began to align with the restoration plan. People who'd been ignored were being asked what they'd need to do their jobs properly. We began rehiring temporarily displaced technicians and negotiating with suppliers on terms that would guarantee delivery without sacrificing cash flow. Then Maria showed me a file I hadn't seen, a whistleblower packet from someone in procurement that documented kickbacks and improper vendor selection dating back 5 years. This was not only negligent governance, it edged into malfeasance. We shared the material with an independent auditor and the law firm handling the litigation. The packet didn't make me gloat. It made me grim. It placed Gerard squarely in the center of a set of decisions that had prioritized appearances and short-term profit over employees, clients, and long-term sustainability. When the story hit that level, where mismanagement bordered on ethical breaches, Gerard's public posture collapsed. He gave a press interview that was clumsy and defensive. He tried to cast himself as a scapegoat for market forces and blamed a hostile cabal. The more he spoke, the more the narrative hardened against him. People who had once smiled and nodded now refused interviews and asked for their own positions to be secured before any rollback. The company's customers sent letters requesting guarantees and changes in management, requests we accepted and implemented. There was a kind of justice in how he fell. It was not cinematic, and it was not instantaneous. It was ledgered and logged, audited and reformed. The executive team was reshuffled. Competent managers were promoted. The COO, who had been a hand-picked friend of Gerard's, was placed on leave pending an internal investigation, and HR was empowered. We implemented transparent procurement processes, publicized our vendor selection criteria, and rolled out a short-term employee bonus structure to repair years of underpayment and oversight. We added an employee advisory board and set up a hotline for complaints with independent oversight. I made a choice early on to let actions speak louder than insults. So rather than parade Gerard's missteps like trophies, I fixed the things that mattered to the people who actually kept the company running. When deliveries resumed and invoices were paid reliably, when employees could plan paychecks instead of holding their breath, the company stabilized. The market noticed. As the weeks turned into months, Gerard's options narrowed. Legal actions he pursued slowed the company, but did not reverse the court's direction. Depositions made public things he'd rather have kept private, and shareholders who had been swayed by his charisma found themselves voting with the ledger. The man who once stood at the head of family tables as if he were carved from marble now took phone calls from collectors and invocations of guarantees. His credit lines changed. His social circle thinned. Family life, predictably, fractured. Muriel tried to organize a public reconciliation at my grandmother's birthday, but Granny shut it down with one look. Mark, who had once expected to inherit both the business and the spotlight, found himself unemployed and stripped of the promise he'd been raised on. He tried to call me thrice that December. I let the calls show as missed. I didn't answer because whatever small echo of brotherhood that had existed between us had been drowned by his years of ridicule. He had chosen his side, and his side had chosen posture over people. People asked me if it felt like revenge. I used to think revenge was a red, theatrical thing. Public humiliation, a viral scandal, the dramatic collapse on the front steps. But the revenge that satisfied me was quieter. Payrolls honored, suppliers paid on time, safety issues fixed, lines of communication restored. The company survived. The people who had been mistreated were no longer sidelined. The man who'd used a dinner table as a stage for tearing people down lost his audience because the audience finally saw proof he hadn't been building anything sustainable. There was the legal closure as well. In the civil suits that followed, the internal audits and procurement investigations became the backbone of a settlement for shareholders and clients who'd suffered losses under the previous regime. Gerard settled several claims quietly in exchange for an agreed resignation package that included a clause preventing him from making public statements that could be considered defamatory. It was not generous. It was pragmatic. His net worth took a hit, and his reputation among peers dwindled. He sold a lakeside property to cover several settlements. The price he paid was not purely financial. He was estranged and, more importantly, exposed. Muriel tried for pity in public, invoking family loyalty and the strain of what we'd built. That line failed where it had once succeeded because people could now see decades of decisions laid out on paper. Mark's prospects were dim. He applied for jobs and was rejected in interviews when background checks turned up the story about his lack of involvement and management experience. He landed a position at a small firm far from home, the sort of job that didn't come with invitations to weddings or boardrooms. He called once on a holiday and left a message that was part apology and part explanation. I never called back. My parents came to visit the office once we had steady processes in place. My father shook my hand like a man who'd been handed a mirror and didn't like what he saw. He said, quietly, "You did good, son." My mother didn't say much, but she met my eye, and it was the first time she'd looked at me like I wasn't that shy boy at the end of the table. People wanted to know if I forgave them. I didn't. Not then, not now. Forgiveness, in my view, would suggest that their behavior was an accident or forgivable oversight. It wasn't. It was conscious, repeated, and corrosive. There would be no family comes together by the fireplace, homecoming. We were reduced to polite nods at the one funeral in the family that felt real, my grandmother's. Even that event was strained, weighty, and stripped of theatricality. Muriel sat across from me and did not try to make amends. She simply looked tired, and I felt only the residue of what had been. What I did do was set boundaries. Gerard's attempts to engage in petty sabotage, anonymous letters, leaked claims about our financing, were countered with facts and legal notice. When he tried to use mutual acquaintances to undermine our client relationships, we addressed each issue transparently. When Muriel tried to arrange a smear through neighborhood channels, the people she thought she could manipulate didn't listen. Sound systems and reputations, once built with charm and bluster, can be dismantled by steadiness and transparency. Today, the company is stable and recovering. We rehired a third of the staff who had left during the worst months, and we instituted an employee stock ownership plan so people who rebuilt the company had a stake in its future. Revenue grew slowly, predictably, and, importantly, ethically. We repaired major client relationships, and a few of Gerard's old loyalists who saw the company thrive under competent leadership reached out to thank me privately. Those conversations were not reconciliations. They were acknowledgments that things had been broken under Gerard's tenure. Legally, the acquisition held. The injunction was dissolved. Gerard's countersuits were either dismissed or settled on terms that left him diminished. He no longer ran the company. He no longer dominated the family room. He tried to visit Granny once after the dust settled, but she received him with a dignity that felt like a verdict. His pleas fell on the floor between them like paper. He moved out of the lakeside house within a year, and the community that once applauded his arrival stopped responding to invitations. What I did not do was rub salt. I didn't show up at family gatherings to gloat. I refused television cameras or sensational outlets when they asked for the dramatic fall. My revenge had never been about spectacle. It had been about righting wrongs and making sure that people who had been treated as expendable received the stability they deserved. In the end, the situation was this. The company survived and is on a steady path to recovery under new, accountable leadership. Day-to-day operations are healthier. Employees have clearer channels for reporting issues, better pay transparency, and ownership stakes. Gerard resigned and settled multiple claims. Financially diminished and socially marginalized, he now lives a quieter life, with a smaller circle and fewer invitations. He is a cautionary example in our town for how charisma can hide rot. Muriel and Mark lost social standing and opportunities. Muriel's attempts to salvage her image failed. She spends her energy on small charity committees where she's less visible. Mark works at a modest firm far from where our family sits at its old table. My parents are distant, but no longer complicit in Gerard's myth-making. They visit rarely and speak carefully. Granny lived just long enough to see some measure of justice and died with a small, private smile the day the company signed a major contract we'd salvaged. I'm in a position of ownership and responsibility I never sought for glory. I work longer hours than I did when I was tinkering in my apartment, not because I enjoy it, but because I feel accountable. I never forgave them in the sense of reconciliation. I forgave myself for letting their words define me for so long, and I reclaimed the narrative by doing the work. If you're asking whether I feel triumphant, yes, in the way of a person who watched something fragile and valuable near collapse and helped pull it back. If you're asking whether I feel settled, no. There are nights I think about the boy who folded his napkin and said 3 words that changed everything. There are mornings I wake before the office opens, drink coffee in silence, and think about how tenuous any legacy really is. The family dinners are over for me. If I go home to visit, it is to see Granny's favorite chair or to speak with someone who needs help, not to play the old game of humiliation and quiet endurance. The people who mistreated us remained villains in my ledger, in their actions, in their priorities, and in the choices they made. They were punished in ways both public and private, diminished trust, financial penalties, and the slow erosion of the social capital they once wielded as armor. I have no desire to rub their faces in it. I have a company to run, people to protect, and a ledger of repairs to keep. Revenge, in truth, tasted best when it was paired with repair, when the company was steadied, when paychecks arrived on time, when injured suppliers were paid, when the people who had been sidelined could look forward again. Sometimes, when the office is quiet late at night, I imagine a future where we're not defined by the mess Gerard made. I imagine employees telling their kids they work at a company that was turned around by someone who cared. That's the revenge I wanted, not some theatrical ruin, but the slow rebuilding of what was broken. So that's what happened. The villains were exposed, they were held accountable, and they are no longer the center of the story. The company lives. The employees breathe easier. The family, for the most part, is fractured and largely silent. I didn't forgive them in the way people sometimes expect. I didn't take pleasure in their fall. I took responsibility for what I could fix, and that was enough. Thanks for watching.